This is a fairly short pre-recorded lecture on emotions because we covered half of it when we talked about the fallacies of thinking. When we were talking about perception, it's usually something I cover in emotions, and so usually this chapter is a little bit longer in class. So this is a fairly short one, but I wanted to pay homage and do an overview of emotions and how they affect us with regard to interpersonal communication. So, starting out, so communicating emotions is both difficult and also very important. It's difficult because of two reasons. One is that it's very hard to think when you're feeling emotional, and usually that means excessive or extreme emotions like anger, fear, confusion, anxiety, or joy. Sometimes it's very hard to think logically, and yet that's probably the time when we do need to think logically. So it could become very difficult because those emotions simply take over because we're human and we're emotional creatures. It's also difficult because many times we don't have good teachers. It might be, if you were lucky, you had parents or guardians that sort of guided you through proper expressions of anger and frustration and how to manage anxiety and how to manage depression and how to show exuberance in proper ways. But I think for most of us, we have not had those good teachers, or we learn certain things, but we don't learn everything. And because we are our own person, again, then we also develop other strategies because we watch movies, we see music videos, we see, drama shows, and so sometimes we think that that's, how people should be responding to things. It's also very important to learn how about communicating emotions, because it's really part of the message's meaning. So in addition to the actual words that you're saying, the content of the message, it's being conveyed or carried by a fair amount of emotion, whether that's anger, fear, depression, stress, happiness, and the receiver is going to pick up on the meaning based on the emotions that you have there. So there's no way to kind of separate the message from the message carriers at that point in time. So moving on to the emotion. Emotion involves, in general, three different parts. The first part is what's the body. We go through physiological changes, as all of you probably have recognized. When you're angry, you feel your blood start boiling. You actually increase in blood pressure. Your heart rate increases. A whole bunch of changes happen. It's the same with fear and the same with exuberance or any kind of extreme sort of emotion. Our bodies go along for the ride. And that also means that we're going to have nonverbal expressions that might not necessarily match what we're doing when we're not feeling those intense or extreme emotions, which is why in the angry moment, I want you to try to videotape yourself or someone else so you can see what's happening nonverbally, because you actually will, your whole facial expression will change as you talk about whatever it is that's upsetting you. So the body is the first component in this triangle. The second part is the mind, and this is a really important part because this is where the interpretations happen. So, what we see someone doing, responding to us in a certain way, and then we immediately create an interpretation of what that thing is, and therefore sort of jump to the conclusion, as you've learned from perception. And this is the really important point here that I have written, which is your interpretation of what happens has a greater effect on your feelings than what actually happens. So let me repeat that again, and I have it in red because obviously this is a testable moment here. So your interpretation of what is happening to you will have a greater effect on your feelings than what is actually happening to you. And if you think about times when you've been really angry or really hurt, and sometimes it's a simple misunderstanding, you see something on Facebook and you immediately get all upset about something, and then you realize later, oh, I didn't actually need to get that upset. So that's an important part of the mind, that the mind really kind of guides us. And then the body goes along for the ride. It says, you want to be upset? Fine, I'll generate all the stuff I need to be upset in this particular situation. And then the final aspect is culture. So culture really provides a framework for expressing emotions and also interpreting emotions, both in terms of us and in terms of other people. So emotional expression is governed by what are called display rules, and that is each culture has particular guidelines on the proper way to express, anger, stress, fear, surprise, happiness, disgust. All of those are governed by a culture that a person is living in. So and it's also governed not only by cultural rules, but it's also governed by gender rules, which in part goes back to culture, right? Because our culture tells us what is appropriate and inappropriate responses for both men and women, of course, which then creates an interesting conversation when you talk about gender fluidity and non-binary people and people that are transgender. It's like, okay, what happens there? Well, that's a whole new mix-up there, which is a wonderful mix-up and certainly an important part of this conversation. So, but these are the three elements that I think are really important to know, that you've got the body, the mind, and culture all together influence what kind of emotion we show, and also how much or the way in which we show those emotions. All right, moving on to my second, basically of two slides here. The next thing I wanted to talk about were the two aspects of emotion. There are two aspects to that. The first is intensity. And so I have here this pain chart that you would usually see if you go to a doctor's office or you go into a hospital and say, how much does it hurt? And they try to quantify it, anything from 0 to 10. So we all have emotional rubrics or metrics where it's like, okay, that anger is probably like a 3, and that would be that person that cut me off on the freeway. But you know, if someone really makes me angry, if something happens at work and I feel that I haven't been listened to or I haven't been, you know, respected in a certain way, then it might be my anger is now a 10. So part of understanding emotion is understanding where you are on the intensity level and being really logical of you know, am I really this angry, or do I just think I'm this angry because I'm feeling it at the moment? So intensity is part of that equation. The other part of the equation is duration. In other words, how long are you feeling that emotion? I think a really good example of the idea of intensity and duration is if you've lost a loved one, you know, a parent or a grandparent, that as time goes on, you're going to feel those waves of grief, and those waves are going to come pretty frequently initially when someone passes away, and they're also going to be pretty intense. So you're going to have high intensity and also frequent duration. As time goes on, one of two things, and sometimes two things actually happen. The first is that sometimes they're less intense. You still feel the waves of sadness and grief, but it's not quite as debilitating as it was initially when it happened. Or it could be that you don't have it happening as frequently, but when it does, it just takes you right under for a little bit of time. And so usually it's one or the other. And then again, over time, as time goes on, as you're now, you know, 8, 10, 13 years away from the death of a parent, both the intensity and the duration drop significantly. And it doesn't mean that, you know, you've loved them any less. They are still a very much a part of your life. It just means that we continue growing and we continue changing, and we learn how to process what is now the new norm. And I think as soon as I say new norm, you know what I'm talking about, because we're living it right now with regard to the pandemic. So those are the two aspects of emotion. And then the two types of emotion that I also talk about, and this is where the self-talk starts coming in. The first type of emotion is what's called facilitative emotions. And facilitative emotions are ones that contribute to effective functioning. So just because you're angry doesn't mean it's bad. Just because you're stressed, it doesn't mean it's bad. There is such a thing as good stress, and that's what's called stress or distress would be a good way to distinguish those things. Having some anxiety is also not negative, because it can help people make a better performance. If you are not nervous before a presentation, then more often than not something is wrong. And so having a little bit of nerves going into a presentation is good because it keeps you on edge, and that if you don't have any tension, you don't have any spring, as I always say. So those emotions, even the ones that we would perceive as being negative, also contribute to effective functioning of a person. If they're angry and they get focused, then they can, you know, meet something head on and try to resolve it. But then you've got, of course, emotions on the bad side, which are what are called debilitative emotions. And these are ones that detract from effective functioning. So these are the ones that completely take you out of the picture. You get so angry that you can't really communicate. You have to walk away from the situation, which in and of itself is not a bad thing. But this is the person that says something they shouldn't regret. This is the person that smashes things. This is the person that probably should go into a rage room, as we've already talked about rage rooms. So the debilitative ones are the negative ones. Let's see, actually I do have another slide I just realized, and that is looking at the sources of debilitative emotions, because those are the ones that get us in trouble. Usually the facilitative ones don't. Those are the ones that help us out. So there are 3 different sources for debilitative emotions, so I will actually go a little over 10 minutes on this presentation. The first source is what's called physiology, and this is really 2 different things. The first is the amygdala, which is in the back part of your brain. That's your you know, your primal emotional gland there. I don't know if it's actually called a gland, but I'm going to call it one. That's the one that's the fight or flight. That's the one that tells you to, you know, start attacking because you're going to get attacked if not. So, and unfortunately, when you're experiencing, for example, stage fright, which is a very easy thing to kind of look at, that when students all of a sudden freeze and they don't know what they're saying and they can't read their notes, it's because the amygdala has clamped onto the prefrontal cortex and said, I'm not letting you work right now because this is too scary for me. And that's what's happening. So we actually have part of our physiology that keeps us from thinking logically, and that's that instinct that we have that comes from our prehistoric ancestors. And also another thought that has been proven over and over again is that we do inherit temperament. And we don't need to get in discussion whether this is a nature or nurture. It's really both, I think. We do inherit genetic material from our parents, and so there may be a predisposition to respond a certain way to things, but also we learn from watching our parents and people around us. So that would also be considered inherited. So if you notice that your father or the mother respond in a certain way to anger, then it might be you do the same, or alternately you kind of swing the other direction and don't show any anger at all. So one or the other is based on what has been observed around you and what you've grown up with. The second source of debilitative emotions, again, those are the negative ones, are your emotional memory. And emotional memory, just defined, is when we have harmless events that trigger feelings because they remind us of something that we've been through before. So that's what's called emotional memory. So those are basically trigger moments. So for a person who has PTSD, emotional memory is the one where something happened in their past, like if they've been deployed and they've been in combat, and then they come home and they hear a particular sound or a particular loud noise, or they hear a particular word, and all of a sudden they're kind of put back into that situation. That's what emotional memory is. And that happens not just with regard to PTSD, although that's clearly the most obvious example of emotional memory, but it can be when we've had conversations with people. If you've been with a friend for a really long time, or you've been with a partner for a really long time, and you have certain arguments that kind of come up all the time because of a certain word, or you hear a certain phrase, and it immediately kind of sends you into, crazy mode where it's like, I can't believe you said that to me. And then you talk to someone who is not your partner and they say the same thing, and you kind of like all of a sudden get really crazy again when it's like, no, that isn't what they meant at all, that they didn't mean to say it that way, but because we have those emotional connections, our brains immediately process like that. Oh, there's that word again, or there's that saying again. I got to get all upset about this whole thing one more time. So that's what's called emotional memory. And finally, this is the one that we've actually talked about, which is self-talk. And really what it is what we say to ourselves becomes our reality. Okay. So the reality is that nobody can make you feel bad. You decide to feel bad. You make a conscious decision to get angry or anxious or fearful or some other negative emotion, and part of that is because we have that inner monkey in our brain that's kind of spinning out of control and saying that things are worse off than they actually are. And so sometimes things are as worse off as they are, but many times we kind of make it worse than what that it is, and then we go, oh, okay, that wasn't so bad, like getting that vaccine or getting donating blood, or having to take some exam or give a speech, and all of a sudden your brain works up into something big, and it's really not. It's actually pretty small. So that self-talk, which is what we then talked about in terms of the fallacies of self-talk, kind of gets us into trouble. So there are my 4 slides. I thought I had fewer slides. I actually had another one. And then this is something that I'm not going to play now because I think you can watch it on YouTube, and I'll put it in the module as a separate thing to watch. It's called Why We're Unhappy. It's called The Expectation Gap, and you can see there it's a TEDx talk, so it's also closed captioned, and he says some very important things, and I want to just emphasize that I usually show this in class, and usually there's at least one quiz question based on what he says, and I think what he says is very wise, and he says it in a fairly short time frame, so that's all good. So there you go. There's your 13 minutes and 54-second discussion about emotions that probably would have taken me a little bit longer in class, but now you can watch it at your leisure. So now that you know that, now we can focus back in on language and nonverbal communication.